My name is Megan Calloway. I'm 31 years old. And the afternoon my family decided I was the problem, I learned that in certain households, the person who cries the loudest is automatically the one who gets believed. My sister-in-law stood in my parents' dining room with her hands pressed flat on the table, her voice breaking just enough to sound convincing, and told my mother and father that I had spent months sharing private details from her and my brother's marriage counseling sessions with my coworkers and her social circle. She said I had humiliated her deliberately. She said I was jealous of what she and my brother had built together. She said she'd been patient long enough and couldn't be in the same room with someone who betrayed her that way. My mother covered her mouth. My father looked at me like I had tracked something foul across a clean floor. My brother, who had sat beside his wife every Sunday dinner for 7 years and borrowed my car the summer his transmission blew, stared at the centerpiece like it was the most interesting thing he had ever seen. Nobody asked me a single question, my father said. You need to apologize to her, and mean it, or you're not welcome at family gatherings until this is resolved. I looked around that table at faces I had known my entire life and realized that none of them had paused even long enough to wonder whether any of it was true. So I didn't argue. I didn't cry. I set my napkin down beside my plate, picked up my jacket from the back of the chair, and walked out through the front door without a word. I sat in my car in the driveway for about 2 minutes, watching the light behind the curtains, and then I drove home. I worked as a landscape architect for a mid-size firm in Richmond, Virginia. I spent my days designing drainage systems, selecting native plantings, and arguing with contractors about grading specifications. It was the kind of work that required patience and precision, and it had taught me that most problems look worse from the surface than they actually are once you start digging. That turned out to be useful information. The following week was quiet in the way that feels intentional. My mother texted twice, both times asking if I had thought about what my father had said. My brother didn't reach out at all. I went to work, designed a retention pond for a commercial property in Henrico County, ate dinner alone, and tried to figure out what exactly I was supposed to have done, and why my sister-in-law had chosen that particular Sunday to do it. My best friend Jess worked as a copy editor for a regional magazine, and had the kind of brain that could hold 12 unrelated facts in suspension until the pattern connecting them finally surfaced. She showed up at my apartment on a Wednesday night with Thai food, a bottle of wine she described as aggressively drinkable, and an expression that told me she had already been thinking about this longer than I had. She sat across from me at my kitchen table and listened to the whole thing from start to finish without interrupting once. When I finished, she was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "Your sister-in-law didn't come up with that story on the spot. Nobody performs that well without rehearsal." I said maybe I really had said something I shouldn't have, and maybe it got back to her in a distorted way, and maybe I was misremembering. Jess looked at me the way she looked at manuscripts that had been edited so many times the original intention had gotten buried under corrections. She said, "You are doing the thing where you absorb someone else's guilt because it feels less frightening than accepting that someone who was supposed to love you decided to lie. Stop trying to make yourself the reasonable explanation. Start asking what she needed to cover up." She was right, and I didn't want to say so I poured more wine instead. The next morning I started thinking historically. I went back through the previous 8 months in my memory the way I would approach a site survey, systematically, looking for what didn't match the landscape I thought I knew. My sister-in-law and I had never been close. She was charming in public and territorial in private, the kind of woman who made sure every room understood she had the most interesting story in it. My brother adored her in the way that certain people adore things they worked hard to acquire. She had never been outright hostile to me. But there had been moments, small and dismissible individually, where she had made sure I understood that my position in my brother's life was now secondary to hers. I had accepted that as normal because I thought that was what it meant to have a sister-in-law. What I had not paid attention to was how those moments had accelerated in the months leading up to the dinner. She had been short with me at Easter. She had been pointed at a birthday gathering in March. She had made a comment about my closeness with my brother's college friends that I had chalked up to a bad day. I had not thought to connect them. I called Jess and said, "Something shifted around February or March. I just didn't read it." Jess said, "People don't start building a case against someone unless they're afraid of something." What was she afraid of around February? That was the question that mattered. I didn't know the answer yet, but I knew someone who might. My brother's friend group had always included a woman named Carla, who had gone to school with him and remained close enough to both of them that she attended every major event and sent the kind of birthday texts that proved she had actually been paying attention. Carla was warm and observant, and had a deep discomfort with dishonesty that made her both an excellent friend and occasionally an exhausting one. I texted her carefully. I said I wasn't asking her to take sides. I just wanted to understand whether she had noticed anything different about my sister-in-law in the early part of the year. Carla didn't answer for 2 days. When she did, she asked if we could meet in person. We met at a coffee shop near the museum district on a Saturday morning. Carla was already there when I arrived, holding her cup with both hands like she needed something to anchor her. She had clearly spent the intervening 2 days deciding how much she was willing to say. She told me she'd heard things, not facts, she was careful about that word, but patterns. She said there was a man, someone who worked in the preservation and restoration space, who had been coming up in connection with my sister-in-law's name more frequently than made sense given that they had no obvious professional overlap. She said she didn't know what it meant. She said she had told herself it was probably nothing because people talked. I asked his name. She hesitated long enough that I almost let her off the hook. Then she said it. His name was Derek, and he ran his own residential restoration contracting business in the Carytown neighborhood. That was the second crack. After I left Carla, I sat in my car and thought about what she had said and tried to decide whether I was constructing something that wasn't there because I needed an explanation. Jess had warned me about this, the tendency to build a theory and then look for evidence to fit it rather than the other way around. So I stopped chasing Derek for a few days and let the question sit. During that pause, I remembered something I had almost entirely forgotten. 3 years earlier, when my parents were planning a kitchen renovation, my sister-in-law and I had jointly registered on a home contractor platform called BuildMatch, a listing service that connected homeowners with licensed contractors for renovation work. The idea had been that we would use the shared account to collect quotes and coordinate with my parents, who were not especially comfortable navigating online platforms on their own. We had used it for about 4 months, shared the login, coordinated 3 or 4 contractor conversations, and then the project stalled when my father's health required attention and the renovation got postponed indefinitely. I had not thought about BuildMatch in probably 2 years. It was one of those accounts that gets opened for a purpose and then simply persists in the background of your digital life. The reason I remembered it at all was that I had just received an automated email from them. The subject line read, "Account contact verification and policy update." It was the kind of email that service platforms send when they update their terms of service and need to confirm that all registered contacts are still active. The email had gone to both of the addresses originally associated with the account, mine, and my sister-in-law's old email, which was the one she had been using before she switched addresses when she and my brother moved. I almost deleted it. Instead, I clicked through. The account was still open. It still had both of us listed as account managers. And because the platform had recently introduced a new activity transparency feature as part of their terms update, the email included a summary of recent account usage sent to all registered contacts. I stared at the screen for a long time. The account had been used regularly over the past 14 months. Not by me. I hadn't logged in since the renovation project fell apart. The usage showed repeated contractor outreach, private messaging through the platform's internal system, and several bookings for site consultations through a profile associated with one contractor in particular. His name was Derek Stahl. The messages themselves weren't visible in the summary, but the booking records were. 6 site consultations over 11 months, 4 of them scheduled outside normal business hours. 2, listed under a residential address that I recognized as a short-term rental property my sister-in-law managed as a side income stream, a property that had no known renovation work scheduled and that my brother had mentioned only in passing as something she handled independently. I forwarded the email to my own phone. Then I sat very still at my kitchen table for about 10 minutes. I called Jess. I said, "I need you to look at something." She came over within the hour. She read through the summary twice, checked the dates against a mental calendar, and then leaned back in her chair and said, "She has been using your shared account to communicate with him because her own contact history is clean that way." If anyone ever looked at her messages or her email, there's nothing there. It's all sitting in an account she assumed was dormant. That thought landed somewhere cold in my chest. She wasn't afraid I had shared marriage counseling details. She was afraid of something else entirely, and she needed my credibility destroyed before it became relevant. The next question was what to do with what I had. Jess said, "Don't go to her first. You'll hand her time to perform her way out of it." I said I wasn't sure the booking records were enough. They were circumstantial. A contractor doing off-hours consultations on a rental property wasn't itself proof of anything. She could explain it. My family was already primed to believe her version of events, and my parents were not the kind of people who responded well to being told they had made a mistake. I needed something that couldn't be performed around. So I did the thing that felt uncomfortable and necessary at the same time. I sent a message through the BuildMatch platform to the account inbox, which I still had full access to. I kept it brief and professional. I identified myself as one of the registered account managers and explained that I believed there may have been activity conducted through the shared account without my awareness, and that I wanted to understand the current state of the account's communication history before I took any next steps. Then I waited. The platform responded in 48 hours. Their support team confirmed that under their updated data access policy, all registered account managers had equal rights to the complete communication archive. They attached the full message history. Jess was sitting at my kitchen table when I opened it. I read it once and then handed my phone to her without saying anything. She read it for a long time. When she looked up, her face was very still. She said, "This isn't whispers and coincidence." The messages were dated, detailed, and unambiguous. My sister-in-law had been conducting an affair with this contractor for over a year. The platform had been her communication channel because it looked like contractor coordination from the outside, and because she had simply forgotten it was a shared account. The booking records for the rental property were a cover for meetings that had nothing to do with renovation work. There were references to specific dates, specific locations, and one message sent in early February, where she said she was worried that someone close to my brother had started asking the wrong questions and that she needed to get ahead of it. Early February. The same month, I had noticed the shift in her behavior toward me. She hadn't accused me of betraying her because I had done anything. She had accused me because I was close enough to my brother's life that I might eventually stumble into what she was hiding, and she had decided the safest move was to remove me from the board before I became a threat. I sat with that for a full evening before I did anything else. I made a pot of coffee and a terrible omelet and looked out my apartment window at the neighbor's sycamore tree and thought about how much easier it would have been to just let it go. Accept the exile. Start over. Stop performing forgiveness for people who had never really offered me fairness in the first place. But there was my father's face at that table. There was my mother's hand over her mouth. There was my brother staring at the centerpiece. There was the fact that none of them had asked me a single question, and none of them had considered for even a moment that the woman crying loudly at the dinner table might be crying for reasons that had nothing to do with me. Jess said, "The question isn't whether you want revenge. The question is whether you're willing to keep carrying what she loaded onto you." I wasn't. We spent the following evening being careful. I wasn't going to forward a messy, emotional accusation that could be dismissed as bitterness or retaliation. The sequence had to be clear. The source had to be unimpeachable. The document had to explain itself without me explaining it. I wrote an email to my mother, my father, and my brother. I did not write to my sister-in-law. In the email I explained, plainly and without drama, that I had been falsely accused of betraying a confidence I had never broken. I explained that 3 years earlier, my sister-in-law and I had jointly registered an account on a contractor platform for the purpose of assisting with my parents' planned kitchen renovation. I explained that I had recently been notified as a registered account manager of recent platform activity conducted through that account. I explained that after requesting the communication archive, which I was entitled to as a co-manager, I had received documentation that made clear why my sister-in-law had needed my credibility undermined before anyone thought to ask me about it. I attached the BuildMatch support email confirming my access rights. I attached a clean, dated summary of the message history I had received. I kept it to the sections that were unambiguous and undeniable. I did not editorialize. I did not call her names. I did not speculate about my brother's feelings. At the end, I wrote one sentence. I will not apologize for something I did not do, and I will not accept a version of this family that requires me to. I sent it at 8:47 in the morning. By 9:15, my phone was going. My mother first. Her text read, "We didn't know any of this. Please call me." My father, 12 minutes later. "We need to talk. Come over." My brother, a number I had not heard from in weeks. Just, "Call me." Then my sister-in-law, 3 times in a row, the last one reading, "You don't understand the full situation, and you are going to make everything worse." I put my phone face down on my desk and finished my site plan for the Henrico County project. I worked for 2 hours. Then I picked up my phone and replied to all of them with the same 2 words. Not yet. Because I wasn't ready to have that conversation until I had decided what I actually wanted from it. My brother called 6 more times over the following 2 days. I let them go to voicemail. My mother left a message saying she and my father were devastated and wanted the chance to make it right. My father's single text, the most he had communicated with me in 3 weeks, said he had read the documents and wanted to understand how he had missed what was happening. My sister-in-law stopped trying to contact me by the 2nd day. That told me more than any message she might have sent. On the 3rd day, Jess came over, and we sat on my apartment floor eating sandwiches, and she asked me what I was going to do next. I said, "I'm going to make them say it out loud." My brother called 1 more time that evening, and I answered. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "I didn't know." I said, "I know you didn't. But you also didn't ask." He didn't argue with that. He said he was sorry, and I believed that he was, in the particular way that people are sorry when the consequences of their passivity finally land on them. He was sorry in the way that meant he felt terrible, not in the way that meant he understood what had actually happened in that dining room. Those are 2 different kinds of sorry, and I had learned in my 31 years to tell them apart. I asked him one question. "Did you ever believe, at any point, that I had actually done what she said?" He was quiet too long. I said, "That's your answer and mine." The family meeting happened at my parents' house on a Thursday evening. I drove over in the rain. My brother was there. My sister-in-law was not, which told me something about the nature of the gathering. My mother had made coffee and set out cups she wasn't going to use. My father stood near the window with his arms folded in the way that men who are trying to look composed often stand when they are not. My mother said she was so sorry, and that she should have asked questions. I appreciated that she said it without prompting, and I told her so. My father cleared his throat and said, "We reacted too quickly." I had been prepared for something like this, and I had been prepared to feel the same deflation I had read about in the comment that circulated in my mind all week. Not grief for what they'd done, but fear of what I might do with what I knew. Too quickly. Not carelessly. Not cruelly. Not without a second thought for the daughter they threw out of the dinner table like an inconvenience. I said, "You didn't react too quickly. You chose the easier explanation." My mother started crying. My father's jaw tightened. I said, "I'm not here to punish you, but I need you to understand what actually happened at that table, because if we smooth this over with apologies that don't name it, it will happen again." My brother said, "It won't happen again." I looked at him and said, "You sat next to her for 7 years. You sat there at that table and watched her accuse me of something she knew I hadn't done, and you stared at the centerpiece. That is the thing that needs to change, and acknowledging it is the only way it does." The silence that followed was the most honest thing that room had produced in a long time. My father finally said, "You're right." And then he said it again, slower, like he was testing how it sounded. "You're right." That was not the dramatic reversal I might have wanted at an earlier point in my life. It was not a scene from a movie. It was 2 words from a man who did not often offer them, and I decided that was worth something, even if it wasn't everything. What happened after was smaller and less tidy than the stories we tell about justice. My sister-in-law moved out of my brother's house the following month. My brother went through the first stages of grief and anger and bargaining that come with discovering that the life you built was constructed on a foundation you didn't know was hollow. I didn't become his support system for that. Not right away. Not until he had sat with the full reality of it for long enough to stop blaming himself. That took a while. The contractor whose name appeared throughout the message history quietly declined to renew his BuildMatch account around the same time. My sister-in-law did not lose everything. People like her rarely do. And part of growing up is accepting that the world doesn't always redistribute consequences evenly. But she lost her version of events, and that turned out to matter more than I expected. She showed up at my apartment unannounced one evening, standing on my doorstep without makeup in a way that seemed almost calculated to communicate vulnerability. I opened the door, but not the screen. She said, "I made a terrible decision, and it destroyed my marriage. I didn't have to pull you into it." I said, "But you did." She said, "I was scared." I said, "You were strategic. Those aren't the same thing." She looked at me with something I couldn't fully read, and then she said, "I don't expect you to understand." I said, "I understand exactly what happened. You needed a reason for people not to trust me before I stumbled into something you were hiding. You chose me because I was available, and because you knew my family well enough to know that a woman crying at a dinner table would always get the benefit of the doubt over a woman who simply asked to be believed." She had no reply for that. After a moment, she turned and walked back to her car. I watched the taillights until they disappeared, and then I went back inside and stood in my kitchen for a while, not doing anything in particular, just letting the quiet settle around me. Jess came over the next morning, and we painted the accent wall in my living room, a deep slate green, which she had been trying to talk me into for 2 years. While we painted, she said, "Do you feel better?" I thought about it seriously before answering. I said, "I feel like myself. I'm not sure that's the same as better, but it's something I hadn't felt in a while." She said that was probably the more important thing anyway. My mother called every Sunday for the next month. Some of those calls were easier than others. My father never called, but he did start texting, short and infrequent, the occasional link to an article he thought I would find relevant to a project I had mentioned. It was the closest thing to fluency and apology that he knew, and I decided to accept it in the spirit it was offered, without pretending it was more than it was. My brother and I went for a walk along the river trail on a weekend in early fall. We talked for 3 hours about things that weren't the divorce, and then for about 20 minutes about the things that were. He said, "I should have said something at that table." I said yes. He said, "I kept thinking she must have a reason." I said, "She did. It just wasn't the reason she told you." He nodded and said, "I trusted her more than I trusted my own read on the situation." I said, "That's the kind of mistake you only make once if you're paying attention." He was quiet for a little while. Then he said, "I'm paying attention now." Somewhere in those weeks, I stopped waiting for the moment when I would feel like the chapter was fully closed. That moment doesn't exist. Things don't close the way we expect them to. They just stop taking up as much of the room. I went back to my site plans and my drainage calculations and my arguments with contractors about grading specifications. I designed a small residential garden in Church Hill for a woman who wanted something that would attract native pollinators, and I spent an afternoon sourcing plants I had never worked with before. That afternoon felt clean and quiet and mine in a way that was hard to articulate. Justice, I had learned, does not always look the way it does in the version of the story you rehearse in the car at night. It is not always a scene of reckoning. It is not always a villain admitting what they did while the room watches. Sometimes it looks like documentation. Sometimes it looks like the truth sitting quietly in an inbox, indifferent to how much anyone wanted to argue with it. Sometimes it looks like 2 words you say to yourself in the middle of an ordinary afternoon that mean you have stopped waiting for someone else to tell you who you are. The week before the family meeting, when I had been deciding whether to send the email at all, Jess had asked me what I was most afraid of. I said I was afraid my family would read the whole thing and still find a way to protect the story that was easier. She said, "Maybe they will, but you will have written it down. And the thing about writing the truth down is that it stops belonging only to you. It goes somewhere. It becomes part of the record." That was the real weight of it. Not the email, not the documents, not the reply with 2 words instead of a phone call. The thing that had changed was simpler and harder to describe. I had stopped performing a version of myself designed to make other people comfortable with their choices. Once you stop doing that, the architecture of everything that was built around it starts to show its age. My father said something to me at the end of the family meeting that I have thought about more than anything else from that evening. He was walking me to the door, And he said, "Your mother and I made a decision based on what was in front of us." I stopped with my hand on the doorknob. I said, "I know." He said, "That's not good enough." And then he opened the door for me, which was such a small and ordinary gesture that I almost missed what he was actually saying. He was saying he knew. Not just about the accusation, about the table, about the centerpiece, about the kind of household that makes its children prove they deserve to be believed. I walked to my car and sat there for a moment. And then I drove home through the Richmond streets that were starting to feel less like exile and more like mine. If you are watching this, and you know what it feels like to stand in a room full of people who love you and realize that not one of them thought to ask whether what they'd been told was true, I want you to know that the worst part is not the lie. The worst part is the silence of the people who should have asked. And the question I am still turning over is this one. When the proof finally arrives and the apologies follow, do you trust the love that only showed up after the paperwork did? Or do you rebuild something new on ground that is finally, honestly, level? From where I'm standing now, I think that is the only question worth asking. And I'm still deciding what I believe the answer is.